Thank you. And oh, wait. One last special thing I forgot to say. Thank you very much, Christian Walker and my office for coordinating and organizing this event with me. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll second that. Thanks, Christian. All right, so I'm going to stop that share and bring up a different screen. And I don't see where it is. So let's see, okay. Sorry, folks, that it didn't work the way I thought it was going to. All right, so I think I'm going to be able to get it right this time. Yes. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone. As Tini said, this is our first of these 1 hour leadership talks, and I'm delighted to have you here today. As you're going to see, that I'm going to at the end ask for thoughts, questions about anything I say today. However, I would really appreciate it if instead of waiting till the end, if you've got a thought or a question, if you just unmute or use the chat feature. I'm better at unmuted than chat, but I can read chat as well. And pose your thought or question as we go along. I would appreciate that even more than waiting to the end. All right. So our story begins in 1835 with the publication of Charles Lyell's fourth edition of the Principles of Geology. So it's 1835, so titles of books are never as simple as Principles of Geology. And his full title is Principles of Geology, being an inquiry into how far the former changes of the Earth's surface are referable to causes now in operation. So in other words, what Lyell was communicating with his title was, if we look carefully at the surface of the Earth and how it has changed over time, even the time in our lifetime, we can see these deep operations occurring below the surface. So what? So what? Well, it turns out that that fourth edition of Lyell's book was particularly volcanic because that was the first time that Lyell directly challenged the almost universally held belief, because remember, it's 1835 in England, and the almost universally held belief as interpreted in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, of being 6,000 years old. And Lyell said, no, it's not 6,000 years old. The Earth is 6 billion years old. Okay, so what? Well, turns out that Lyell's careful observations, published in 1835, really provided a critical element to Charles Darwin. Now, he's not going to publish for another 24 years, not until 1859. But in 1859, again, based upon his own careful observations, but also Charles Lyell's, he publishes The Origin of Species, and the rest, as they say, is history. So what do two 19th century naturalists, that's what we would, today we would call Lyell and Darwin scientists or researchers, but in the 19th century, they were referred to as naturalists. So what would they have to do with 21st century leadership? Well, I want to make the argument that in a world that has published, on average, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but in round numbers, 10,000 books and peer-reviewed journal articles every year since 1996 on the topic of leadership. So over 250,000 books published in these almost 25 years. And so there's obviously not absolute convergence on what leadership is or how to be effective at it. So I think actually Lyle and Darwin have something really important to say to us about leadership. And that is leadership effectiveness might best be achieved by careful observation, just as they had done in their two critically important works. But not just careful observation generically, but here when we're talking about leadership, three categories of careful observation. Careful observation of self, careful observation of others, and careful observation of the world. So when we think about careful observation of self, we're gonna want to begin with questions, including what I think is one of the most important questions that leaders, but really I would argue anybody ask of themselves, and that is, how do I use my time? How do I allocate this non-storable resource that once it's spent, it can never be retrieved, it can never be spent twice. So how do I use my time? And what Lyle and Darwin would remind us is that we're going to need data and observations, and not just hunches and intuitions. Well, I think this is how I'm pretty certain. No. They're going to argue we've got to have data and we've got to have observations. In other words, we would need time logs or calendars with precise and detailed entries indicating how much time we spent doing what. And then with careful observation, because that's always going to be the critical element. So we collect the data, we collect the observations, and then we carefully observe them, and we start looking for patterns. We start looking for insights from these precise and detailed entries. And we start asking a range of questions. For example, how much time am I spending taking care of my health? Things like sleep and diet and exercise. And is it adequate to meet the demands of the day and what is required of me? And here I'm going to argue that one of the most critical characteristics of effective leaders is that they have sufficient energy to carry through the day. And you can't have that kind of energy, that kind of health, without paying attention to your sleep, your diet, and your exercise. So am I spending enough time taking care of my health adequately to meet the demands of the day and what is required of me? I'm also going to want to ask, how much time am I spending at work or studying? And how much time when I am working or studying am I distracted? Because there's been some just wonderful research that was originally done at Stanford by a researcher named Philip Nass. And what Nass demonstrated, I think conclusively, is that the more distracted we are, not only do we accomplish less work, but the quality of the work that or studying that we accomplish is diminished, is suboptimal. In fact, Nass did some just fascinating research on what happens when we're doing any task. And in this particular case, he used driving in a simulator. What happens when we're distracted? And what happens is we can get into some very serious problems, again, in simulated driving. But he was able to extrapolate from that any time we get distracted, and these are chief among the distractions, anything that beeps or vibrates. When we get distracted, the quality and quantity of our work or study goes down, the quantity and the quality. So I want to be paying attention. In my notes, I started working on this, but I got a phone call or I got an email that I answered, so on and so forth. So to answer any questions about how we spend our time, again, we're going to have precise and detailed data and observation. Otherwise, we're just guessing. And guessing's never going to be a good strategy if we want to become more effective leaders, or we want to become more effective students, faculty, staff, or human beings. So careful observation about self would include not only really carefully looking at how we spend our time, but it also would include questions about our emotions. For example, we would want to know what experiences and people energize me. When I'm around them or I'm engaged in that activity, I just have a wealth of energy and focus and attention. And there are other experiences and people that drain me, that have the absolute opposite effect. Once again, however, we're going to need precise and detailed data and observations, because if we don't, we're just, and you can anticipate this, making a guess. So what Lyell and Darwin both understood is that it takes a lot of time and effort to record those careful observations, to record those data, and it takes a lot of time and effort to analyze them well and truly. And there simply is no substitute for that time and effort if we want to reach accurate and therefore useful conclusions about how we spend our time, what it is that energizes us or drains us, and so on and so forth. So in other words, careful observation of self is hard work. And there's simply no way around that. And the reason it's hard work is that we're trying to do with our lives what Lyell was trying to do, studying the morphology of the Earth's surface. He's trying to look at the surface, but gain understanding to what was deeper than what was on the surface. In other words, what was causing these observable changes. So not only do we want to record questions, Julie, is that a question? Okay, so we want to be. I'm sorry. Let me jump back a slide. So the reason it's hard work is we're trying to look carefully at the surface of our lives in order to understand the deep causes of not only what energizes us or drains us, but also, and this is the critical part, why we think that happens. And now we have to have those careful and precise data. They're prerequisites to this sustained thinking and analysis. So we have to have both. Just collecting the data is not enough. Trying to make hunches, intuitions without data is not going to work. We've got to have both in order to gain a deep understanding of ourselves. So now let's go back to that idea that leadership effectiveness might be best achieved by careful observation of self, others, and the world. And now what I want to do is I want to look at this idea of careful observation of others. And I want to make this claim. I think careful observation of others is actually even harder than careful observation of ourselves. And that's true for a lot of different reasons. But two that I want to focus on this afternoon are I'm going to call projection and homophily. So let me define what I mean by those two terms. So projection is going to be this idea that we project or we map our perceptions of the world onto the world itself. In other words, it's this idea that we assume that the world as we see it is the world as it is. And on one level, how could it be otherwise? How could we not look at the world and not have it make sense, have it, cohere, kind of seem to be a whole, it's not patchy, we're not missing, it's not pixelated, something like that. So there's a sense that, well, how could it be otherwise? And this idea is often referred to in the literature as naive realism. I'm not keen on that term. I prefer intuitive realism. But if you do a search on intuitive realism, I don't think anything or much is going to show up. You search naive realism, this idea is going to show up. So naive realism is the idea that everyone sees things the same way, if they see things correctly. So let me give you an example. Of course, it's obvious that everyone sees a rabbit, right? I mean, after all, there's the mouth, there's the eye, there are the ears. That clearly is a rabbit. Well, of course, not everyone sees a rabbit. Some people see a duck instead. They see the back of the head, they see the eye. Interestingly, of course, the eye is in the same location on both the duck and the rabbit. And instead of seeing ears, they see a beak. By the way, this illustration was first done in 1899 by a psychologist named Jacob Jastrow, Jastrow. So naive realism would not be a problem if, but that's the big conditional, everyone's seeing things. I'm going to ask you to look kind of carefully at this little cartoon. Everyone's seeing things from their own perspective, acknowledged others' points of view. So I'm going to let you look at that little cartoon for just a moment. So the problem is we confuse acknowledging someone's viewpoint with agreement with their point of view, if you will. And that brings us to this second idea, homophily. So homophily is a biological principle, and it simply refers to the idea that animals flock and herd together. They do so for safety and reproductive advantage. And that's where we get the saying, birds of a feather flock together. And what's true for all other animals on the planet is also true for us. That homophily is just as true a biological principle for Homo sapiens as it is for all the other animals on the planet. So what that means is that we like to be around people who are a lot like us in every imaginable way. And what that means is that projection and homophily now create this kind of perfect feedback loop that is self-reinforcing. So in other words, we're spending time with people who see the world the way we do, and that reinforces that, well, we must be seeing it right because everybody else sees it the same way. So in other words, our projection of our perceptions of the world are routinely reinforced and strengthened by the people we tend to spend the most time with, because we tend to spend the most time with people who are like us. And when we are around people who are like us, it's actually a very pleasurable experience. It's a very low demand on our cognitive activity because we see the same things. There's very little argument. There's teasing and joking and stuff like that. There's very little argument, very little conflict, because we are all seeing things the same way. And that, of course, in that little middle cartoon where the little penguin there is seeing the world differently than do the three flamingos, and that's why it creates that sense of distress. So let's go back to this idea of naive realism. The real risk of naive realism is that when others see the world the way we do, we assume they see things correctly. That is, they see things the right way. On the other hand, when others don't see the world the way we do, we assume they see things incorrectly. That is, they see things the wrong way. And that naturally prompts the question, so why? Why would people see things the wrong way? Well, one possibility, and this is actually the most common, and in many respects, it's relatively benign, not totally, however. But one possibility is that, well, they're young, they'll know better when they get older, more mature, seasoned. I've seen this in every organization that I've worked in and I'm old, so I've worked in 3 different organizations for a total of 40 years. And in each of them, the people, because, 40 years ago, I was a young person. And when I joined the organization and I'd ask questions, people would often say, well, Gene, once you've been here for a while, once you really know how things work, you'll understand. And it isn't always cynical. I mean, it certainly can have that tinge to it. But it's also that idea that when we're young, when we haven't had that much experience in life, there are things that we just can't see until we've been on the planet longer. So that's kind of the more benign of the possibilities. They're young, they'll know better when they get older, more mature, seasoned. Another less generous possibility is, well, of course, they don't see things the way we do. They're not as smart, they're not as educated, they're not as worldly or sophisticated as I am or we are. But the most dangerous possibility, and this is the one that I have the greatest concern for, is we make the assumption, actually, no, they do see things the way I do. They're pretending they don't, because they're trying to get an advantage. They're trying to maybe sabotage my efforts or something. But they know what's really going on. They're just pretending otherwise. And the problem is that it's a very small step from assuming actually people do see things the way I do. They're pretending otherwise, and it's because they have bad intent. And I want to try and persuade you to this argument that the best leaders are constantly questioning their assumptions about others, especially assumptions about others having bad intent. So let's return one last time to that idea of leadership effectiveness might be best achieved by careful observation of self, others, and the world. And now I want to focus on this idea of careful observation of the world. And I want to try and persuade you to this idea that careful observation of the world begins with an acknowledgement that luck plays a role in a person's or organization's success. I specifically am going to point you to Robert Frank's book, Success and Luck. Frank is at Cornell. He's an economist at Cornell. And in this book, he argues that a lot of us, in fact, the vast majority of us, when things turn out well in our lives, we take credit for that success based upon our hard work, our ingenuity, our cleverness, our skill, our talent, our intelligence, any number of self-referential qualities or characteristics. I was successful because of my hard work. And you'll notice the subtitle of his book is Good Fortune and the Myth, what he refers to as the myth of meritocracy. And what Frank is trying to do in this book, and I think he does very successfully, is he attacks this idea that when things go well, we take credit for them as though it was simply based upon our merit, and we don't acknowledge the role of luck, except, he argues, we estimate the role of luck, bad luck, when things don't work out. Then we say, well, of course, I couldn't make that happen. I was sabotaged, or, someone just dropped the ball, or, I mean, we make excuses. Everybody's to blame other than us if things don't work out. And if things do work out, then we want the spotlight solely on us. And that's really the idea that Frank is addressing in what he's calling the myth of meritocracy. So good leaders acknowledge that luck plays an enormous role, actually, in our success as individuals and as organizations. And I would argue, including the luck of who our parents were, the environment we grew up in, things like that, that we had absolutely no role in determining. So good leaders, I think, acknowledge the role of luck and its influence on our individual or our organization's success. And as he argues, and I want to support, maybe that role of luck is actually larger than we might think or would even want to acknowledge. So I think that the best leaders know that the race is not always to the swift, that the battle is not always to the strong. They understand that time and chance happens to everyone and to every organization. And as a consequence, they greet success with modesty, and they offer wide praise to all who helped in the effort. And this, I think, is a critical function of good leadership. And quite honestly, I'm very candid with you here in 2021. This is an enormously short supply in our leaders, particularly our leaders on the world stage. So many of them take all the credit if anything turns out well, and they take no responsibility if things go sideways, and in fact engage in blaming others. And that is incredibly, I think, dangerous leadership. But it's certainly the world we're living in now. So this is a not ascendant way of leading. However, it has been a dominant way of leading for thousands of years amongst good leaders. So the best leaders greet success with modesty, recognizing that luck played a role, and at the same time, they make sure that everybody who was involved in the effort is recognized, is praised, is acknowledged, much like Teeny did today and I echoed in thanking Christian. If Christian hadn't set this up, I wouldn't be able to, be talking with you right now. If I didn't have the good fortune of working in Teeny's office, I wouldn't have this up. So luck has played an enormous role, and thanking those, acknowledging those who have been part of that is important. So the best leaders greet success with modesty. They offer wide praise to all who helped in the effort, while at the same time acknowledging the role of luck. And they do so, I think, very wisely, because only those leaders who acknowledge the role of luck in their organization's success or their own individual success can credibly acknowledge the role of bad luck in theirs or their organization's failures. Now, I have intentionally left a lot of time today because I didn't want to just give a talk. I didn't want to just give a lecture. I really wanted to engage in a conversation with all of you. So what I'd like to do now is stop at this point, sharing information, and ask you to offer up your thoughts, your counter proposals to what I've presented. And then, of course, any questions that you have. You could chat, you could unmute. My preference would be unmuting, but I understand on Zoom that's kind of clunky. So you could chat, you could unmute, you could use the little icon, the little raised hand icon, so that I can call on you. So thoughts, questions?
Presentation.
Please, Kelly. Oh, I'm sorry. So someone just spoke and I wasn't. Oh, is it pronounced Kunal?
Yes, it is pronounced Kunal. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course, Kunal.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much. It's so good to hear those words as the leader, and actually refreshing getting some of the dust or the dirt, what we get buried upon in our day-to-day life and
Yeah.
operation needs. You know,
Yeah.
so it was such a brush up, what you mentioned about the rabbit and the duck and all the other illustrations you did. So the question, you know, I think most of us will agree upon as the leaders is that, you know, our day-to-day life to perform at the maximum level, maximum performance, and deliver the services we as a leader are responsible for.
Right.
It also encompasses manpower, manpower, you know, supervision, leadership, and sometimes I would put this coach analogy, right? You have been given a team and you were the last one to be hired.
Yeah.
Right. You didn't pick your team.
Yeah.
You didn't, you know, choose the qualification and the qualities, or more or less the word is character in that person to bring it on the team.
Right.
How do you handle those, what you inherited, and, you know, still stand out or give what we are trying to pursue for?
Yeah. That's a great question. So let me tell you a quick story to illustrate how I think to think about it, because the reality is very, very few leaders ever get to completely pick their team. Almost by definition, you inherit a group of people. And one strategy, I don't favor this one, but I know it certainly happens. I've watched it at Davis for the 25 years I've been there. I watched it at Habitat for Humanity in the 13 years I was there, and I watched it in the Presbyterian Church where I was an assistant minister for a couple of years. So I've seen it happen everywhere. And that is, a new leader comes in, and one of the first things they do is start sending people to the exits so they could build their own team. I think that sends a really risky message to both the people who, of course, are forced to leave the organization, fired, or just their life made so miserable they want to leave, and to the people who are left behind, so to speak. And that is, and I don't think most leaders intend this, but what they're really signaling is, don't invest too much time or effort in this organization, because if there's a change at the top, things could change on a dime. And I think that is a prescription for racing to mediocrity in the organization's performance. On the other hand, I think that, and here I lean very heavily on the research and writing of I think he's probably dead by now because he's ancient. Edgar Schein, Schein. He was at MIT in Massachusetts, and Schein wrote just an incredible book. It went through, I think, at least 5 editions, called Leadership and Organizational Culture. And what Schein says in that book, among other things, it's a huge book, but he says something that I think is very relevant to that question. And he says, leaders really only do 3 things. They create culture, they maintain culture, and they destroy culture. But you'll notice people are not mentioned in any of those. And what he means by that is they create cultures. So they create the types of assumptions that are not present in the organization. So, for example, I want to get this right. I think it was the University of Maryland Medical Center, but I would not swear by it. Could have been Johns Hopkins. I think that was University of Maryland Medical Center. They got in a new dean, and one of the first things that the dean instituted was what she called the 6-foot rule. This is pre-COVID. And what she said was, when you come within 6 feet of another human being, no matter what you are doing, you raise your eyes, make eye contact with them, and greet them. You don't have to spend any time talking or anything like that. You just raise your eyes, you make eye contact, and in passing, you greet them. hello, how are you doing? Something like that. And she stood by that, and she called, when people forgot to do that, she would call their attention to it. And so she instituted that new policy because she thought that people, without intentionally doing so, were signaling to each other indifference to one another. And she realized for the healthcare system to work, everybody, no matter what their role, they have to feel like everybody else is valuable too. So she created a cultural artifact. She maintained some stuff, and then she did something where she destroyed a cultural aspect in that organization. And that was, whenever a decision is going to be made, you only talk first to the surgeons, because the surgeons brought in the most money. And then you talk to everybody else and basically try to convince them that whatever the surgeons wanted, they needed to agree to as well. And she stopped doing that. And instead, what she did was, interestingly, when they were getting ready to make changes, she would go around and she would talk to people who were the lowest status, lowest paid people in the hospital, orderlies, clerks, things like that, that everybody tended to overlook. And she'd ask them, what do you think? And then finally, finally she got back to the surgeons as well, but she didn't start with them. She ended with them. And she basically said, here's what everybody else thinks. I want to listen to your point of view, but I just want you to know that's the context in which I'm going to listen to your point of view. So there's a nice illustration of, she maintained some elements in the culture. She created a really important element, and then she destroyed one of the elements. And I think that would be my approach, is to create culture in whatever team you inherit, and do so very consciously, very deliberately. All right, so I see another hand up, but now I've lost your name, I think. Yeah.
Is it Donald?
Yeah, Christian, is it Donald? Nice looking gentleman with this little
Friendly smile.
A nice smile.
Go ahead, Donald.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to go, Christian. I just had an observation about leadership, and I try to practice good leadership, but one of the things I think a leader needs to do, that is, if you don't allow the people who work for you to try things and possibly fail, that you're really working against yourself, because I've run into a lot of leaders who think of themselves as really good leaders because, I hold everybody accountable.
Yeah.
And they tend to focus on the negative. Yeah. They hold the negative accountable. They don't hold the positive as accountable. Yeah. And the real danger there, I think, and unfortunately, I think I see this in our organization, is that if you don't allow people to take risks, and if people feel they're going to be punished for taking risks, they don't take risks.
Right.
And if they don't take risks, there's absolutely zero innovation in your organization. Yeah. And that's a fairly simple observation, but it's just something I've seen in my career.
Yeah, well, it's a profound observation. And I would say, yes, it's simple, but it's not simplistic. And the way I would distinguish between simple and simplistic is, simplistic is juvenile thinking, young thinking, immature thinking. Simple is very mature, very reasoned thinking. The best visual image I have for that is, everybody is probably familiar with Einstein's famous E=mc² equation. What most of us probably aren't aware of is that he didn't start there. When you go back and you look at his notebooks, there's just pages and pages of these calculations. And what he kept doing is he kept working from the simplistic to the simple. And the simple is on the far side of complexity. Simplistic is on the near side. And so, Donald, what you're talking about is actually profoundly simple, but it's on the far side of complexity. What I mean by that is it recognizes that what we reward and what we punish will have profound effects upon how people behave. And if people are only punished for doing something wrong, then two things are going to happen. It's going to really reduce the volume of activity, which is a perfect prescription for mediocrity. But moreover, and that would be bad enough, just reducing the volume of activity. But the other thing it's going to do, without intending to do so, is it's going to create a culture of blame, not responsibility. And that's the paradox. The leaders, and I think you rightly characterized them this way, they think they're really exercising responsibility. But in fact, what they're really doing, I'm very confident, is they're creating a culture of blame and excuse making. As well as lowered activity, and lowered activity in terms of keeping your head below the water line. So, because if you raise it, you're probably going to get it chopped off. So your observation is profoundly simple, but profoundly right. That we've got to reward risk taking now within boundaries, and we don't want to reward recklessness, but that's what good leaders do, is they present the bounds and they signal if you make a mistake and you learn from it and you correct so that you don't make it again, that's success. My father, who ended up being a captain of a aircraft carrier, had 3,500 men under his command, had this saying, it's only a mistake the second time. It's the first time it's a learning opportunity. It's only a mistake the second time. Anyway, Donald, great observations. Thank you. So Christian, help me out. Who's next?
Next, we have a hand from Patricia.
Patricia, please.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. So I was actually hoping to hear if you could more on, I mean, I think some parts of your presentation could be an entire presentation, like especially sort of the knowing of yourself. Yeah. And then sort of like, stop right there. Right. Sort of like I see on this call, there's some people I know are just wonderful people. Yeah. And, so if I'm sort of an introvert, right. How would that lead to leadership compared to somebody who's a wonderful extrovert, interacts happily and is energized by interacting with all these people? Like, just knowing yourself, how can knowing yourself lead to being a better leader?
That's a great question. So I want to say a few things real quickly. The first is there is clear evidence to suggest that organizations prefer extroverts to introverts. However, there is no good evidence to suggest that's a good decision, because there is just profound evidence that introverts not only make equally good leaders as extroverts, they might actually even make slightly better leaders. However, because it's always messy, it's always got to be with the caveats. And the caveat is that extroverts need to be self-aware enough to not inadvertently penalize introverts, and introverts need to be self-aware enough not to inadvertently penalize extroverts. So let me give you an example, because I'm not an off-the-chart extrovert, but boy, I'm way out at that edge. And I unconsciously, and this goes back to homophily and projection, people who were just as extroverted, just as excited, just as wanted to talk. So I go, oh God, I love that. Well, it's because I'm looking in a mirror. And what I figured out, a few years back now, is that I was inadvertently penalizing the people in my in my pale of responsibility if they were an introvert. So I made a really important change. This is years ago now. And so whenever I convene a meeting, I send out an agenda at least a couple of days ahead of time so everybody can see it. And in fact, I usually send it out a week ahead of time, say, any changes, any suggestions, and then I send out the final version a couple of days ahead of time. When I have the meeting, I always call on everybody who's in the meeting, but I intentionally call on kind of a sprinkling. I don't let people just raise their hands. I call on them, and so that of course drives extroverts crazy. But I'm an extrovert, so I know it's okay. I've learned, and so can they. But what I do is I say, okay, I'm going to call on everybody. So just heads up, and we're going to take a couple minutes right now, just quietly write down your thoughts. And then when I call on you, I want you to read me what you wrote down. I don't want you to just start talking. The extroverts, it drives them crazy. It's an eternity to go 2 minutes without any talk in silence. But the introverts are not, they're not rewarded. They're just not punished by that strategy. And then I go around the room and I sprinkle it. I don't call on all the extroverts first and all the introverts. I sprinkle it because pretty quickly you can figure out who's who. And so I'll call on an introvert and an extrovert, but I won't let the extroverts just start talking. If they don't write, if I don't see them writing, because I've got a list of names, I call on them last because I want them to learn to think between their ears, not just thinking by talking. So great point. And you're right, any of these topics I could have spent more time on, but it's 1 hour. Hey, thank you. There was another question, I believe. Christian? Another hand raised?
I don't see any more hands, but I actually had a question for
good.
myself.
Okay.
Because I know that a lot of different members of the campus community are here. Maybe some of us have very clearly defined leadership authority in certain areas, and maybe others of us are just here to learn for future leadership opportunities.
Sure.
What are some ways that people can put some of these leadership concepts into practice, even if they don't hold a formal leadership title?
Yeah. So and that's a great point. And I want to distinguish between what might be thought of as formal leadership and informal leadership. Because it turns out we way overvalue titles and we way undervalue influence. Because often some of the most influential people in an organization either don't have an exalted title, it might not have any title whatsoever. And sometimes people with exalted titles have very little influence. It's kind of the emperors without clothes idea that, you got the title, but nobody takes you seriously. So influence is how I like to think about leadership as opposed to formal managerial titles and things like that. Because in a knowledge economy, and that's the economy we live in now. We don't live in a production economy. That was back in the mid 20th century when that came to an end. And in a knowledge economy, the paradigm for leadership absolutely gets turned on its head. So I think of the old paradigm of leadership like a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, and this is what most organizational charts to this day still look like. I think it's false. It's not helpful, but they still look like this. The top person is at the top of the pyramid, and then you work your way down through titles all the way down to the bottom. But I remember, and I learned, I heard this story. I've been at Davis for 25 years. So I've known this for 24 years. And as soon as I heard it, I go, oh my gosh, she is right. So most of us, not everyone, but most of us may know that Nordstrom's is a very, very profitable and well-regarded retailer in the arena of merchandising. And Nordstrom's is actually a family last name, and if you're going to be in the absolute top 2 of the top 3 positions, your last name is going to be Nordstrom. But a woman named Betsy Sanders, Elizabeth Sanders, began life at Nordstrom's literally as a part-time clerk. And she worked her way up to the 3rd most, and really in her role, she was equal to because she was the chief operating officer. So that she was equal to a Nordstrom in terms of organizational authority and responsibilities, things like that. And so she interviews for the job and she gets hired, and she's living in Southern California at the time. And Bruce Nordstrom, who was the chief executive officer of the organization, flies her to Seattle, and for the first meeting. And she goes into his office, and it's this big, beautiful office, and she sits down, and he pushes this piece of paper to her that's clearly a hand drawing, or it's clearly been hand drawn. It's got names on it, and it's got these little drawn hands, these upraised hands like this, and she's kind of spinning it and trying not, because you can see her name on it. But when she can read her name, she has to orient the page where it's sort of an inverted V, or inverted pyramid. And so she's spinning it, and Bruce Nordstrom says, "Betsy, let me help you understand what this is. This is our organizational chart. And the correct way to view it is this way." So he spins it around. So now she can read the names, and all these names have little hands on top of them going all the way up. And the very bottom name is his, and then he's got these 2 little hands upraised, and then sitting on top of those 2 hands are his brother's name, I can't remember what his name was, and Betsy's. And then on top of their names, these little hands. And you just keep working up this organizational chart. And at the very top are customers. And what Bruce Nordstrom said to her in that initial conversation is, "My job is to make you and my brother successful. Your job is to make," and then he runs across the names that are sitting on top of there, is to make them successful. And just keep going up, go up, until it gets to the lowest paid, nondescript employees who happen to be right below the customers who are at the very top of the chart. And he said, they have the most important role because they interact directly with our customers. Everybody else has a supporting role. You, me, my brother, and everybody else, except for those people who come in. I think the best organizations and the best leaders fundamentally understand that principle. They understand, especially in a knowledge economy, that the leaders don't have the answers. Everybody else has the answers. And the job of leadership, which is the exact opposite of what it was up through the Industrial Revolution, because in the old industrial paradigm, the leader had the answers and everybody else had the questions. And they would come to the leaders for their insights, their wisdom, their answers. In the world we live in now, it's been turned upside down. And the best leaders recognize it. They recognize that their job is to make the people that report to them successful. And their job is to make the people, again, who report to them. But when you invert the pyramid, this reporting structure makes no sense. Instead, what it makes sense is the job of leadership is to support all the way up till you get to the students at the University of, because the University of California Merced, just like the University of California, is not simply for the faculty or the staff. They have jobs because of the students. So our job, no matter what our role is, yes, we are charged with doing research. No question about that. But no matter what our academic title is, if we're in that realm, is to support students. And if we put students at the top and then everybody underneath, then the job is just to support. Does that make sense? And you don't need a title for that. Because again, in the Nordstrom model, the most important people, their title is sales clerk. Nothing in terms of title, authority, but it's the key. And if leaders understand that idea of supporting up, I think organizations get transformed. I know that was certainly true in my department. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we yeah. So Anna, great question. I think I'm not an expert, but I think that concept, even if not that exact replication, comes out of a guy named John Greenleaf. I believe that's his name. He wrote a book decades ago now called Servant Leadership, and I think that's where this idea comes from. Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to sign off here by saying thank you. Those are my 2 email addresses. If you have questions or thoughts before we end, you'll notice I have 2 of them. And C. Crumley at UC Merced. I go by Gene, but my legal name is Charles Eugene Crumley. So if you send an email to C. Crumley at ucmerced.edu, I'll get it. If you send an email to C.E. Crumley at ucdavis.edu, I'll get it. If you send it to G. Crumley at UC Merced or G. Crumley at UC Davis, it'll be lost in the ether, never to be retrieved. And I'll be honest with you, I do look at my UC Merced email at least once or twice a day. But I look at my UC Davis email, generally 3, 4, 5 times a day. So if you wanted a quicker response, send it to my Davis address. But if you want a response, send it to either address. And again, thank you for your time today. I am honored that you took this hour out. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jean. We'll see you in January, and have a nice, safe, warm winter break, everybody. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
And some folks have asked in the chat if we could provide a link to the recording of today's session.